Mikhail Gorbachev of the Soviet Union. While Gorbachev wanted to preserve the Soviet Union and Marxist-Leninist ideals, he recognized the need for significant reforms. He decided to withdraw troops from the Soviet-Afghan War and met with the United States President Ronald Reagan at the Reykjavik summit to discuss the limitation of nuclear weapons production and the ending of the Cold War. Domestically, his policy of glasnost allowed for the improvement of freedom of speech and free press, while his perestroika sought to decentralize economic decision-making to improve its efficiency. Ultimately, Gorbachev's democratization efforts and formation of the elected Congress of People's Deputies undermined the supremacy the CPSU had in Soviet governance. While various Warsaw Pact countries abandoned Marxist-Leninist governance in 1989, he declined to intervene militarily. Amid growing dissent in the Baltics, in January 1991, Gorbachev demanded that the Lithuanian Supreme Council rescind its pro-independence reforms. Soviet troops occupied buildings in Vilnius and attacked protesters, 15 of whom were killed. A referendum on this issue brought 76.4% in favor of continued federation. Negotiations took place to decide what form the new constitution would take. It was planned to be signed in August. Growing nationalist sentiment within constituent republics threatened to break up the Soviet Union, leading the hardliners within the Communist Party to launch an unsuccessful coup against Gorbachev in August 1991. Without Gorbachev's knowledge, Russian President Boris Yeltsin met with Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk and Belarusian President Stanislav Shushkevich in Belzheva Forest near Brest, Belarus, on the 8th of December, and signed the Belavezha Accords, which declared that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist and formed the Commonwealth of Independent States, or the CIS, as its successor. Gorbachev was furious. He desperately looked for an opportunity to preserve the Soviet Union, hoping that the media and intelligentsia would rally against its dissolution. Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian Supreme Soviets then ratified the establishment of the CIS. On the 9th of December, Gorbachev issued a statement calling the CIS agreement illegal and dangerous. On the 20th of December, the leaders of 11 of the 12 remaining republics, all except Georgia, met in Kazakhstan and signed the Alma-Ata Protocol, agreeing to dismantle the Soviet Union and formally establish the CIS. They provisionally accepted Gorbachev's resignation as president of what remained of the Soviet Union, accepting the fait accompli. Gorbachev said that he would resign as soon as he saw that the CIS was a reality. Mikhail Gorbachev died in a war-torn Russia on the 30th of August 2022, with no violence shed. Petr Mladenov of Bulgaria. During the 1980s, Mladenov became attracted to Mikhail Gorbachev's reform efforts. In May 1989, Todor Zhivkov, longtime leader of Bulgaria since 1954, ordered the expulsion of most of Bulgaria's ethnic Turks. This brought near unanimous international condemnation. Mladenov, who had to field most of the international complaints, was particularly upset because the expulsion violated an international human rights accord he'd signed 4 months earlier. Several other top officials, including Defense Minister Dobry Zhurov, Premier Georgy Antonosov, and Finance Minister Andrei Lukyanov, were also upset with Zhivkov over the expulsion. Along with Mladenov, they began plotting to overthrow Zhivkov. On the 24th of October, Mladenov resigned as foreign minister. His resignation letter was a scathing condemnation of Zhivkov's way of ruling the country. Suspecting that Zhivkov might try to kill him, he sent a copy of the letter to the entire Politburo as well as to Gorbachev. On the 9th of November, just after he returned from a trip to China, Mladenov and his colleagues persuaded Zhivkov to resign, which he did the next day. Mladenov was then elected to Zhivkov's old post as General Secretary of the party and Chairman of the State Council. The latter post was equivalent to that of President. The final legal step in ending communist rule in Bulgaria came on the 2nd of January 1990, when the National Assembly amended the constitution to remove Article 1, which enshrined the Communist Party's leading role. However, for all intents and purposes, communist rule had ended a month earlier when the Central Committee formally renounced its guaranteed right to rule. Mladenov resigned as president in July 1990 after allegedly suggesting the use of tanks against anti-government demonstration in December 1989. Mladenov died on the 31st of May 2000 following complications from a heart bypass. Miloš Jakeš of Czechoslovakia. Following the ousting of Gustav Hašek at the dramatic party meeting in December 1987, Jakeš was nominated for the position of General Secretary by the competing factions within the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. Following his rise to power, Jakeš began to promote himself as a supporter of glasnost and perestroika. Yet, despite the Communist Party's attempt to appease the public's demand for reform, Jakeš remained staunchly opposed to any dialogue with the growing opposition movement in the country. Even when the Velvet Revolution broke out, Jakeš refused to consider any serious talks with the opposition. Events soon overtook him, and on the 24th of November, he resigned along with the party's entire presidium. The Communists officially abandoned power 4 days later. Egon Krenz of East Germany. Following popular protests against East Germany's communist government, the SED Politburo voted to remove Erich Honecker as leader on 18th of October 1989, and Krenz was elected as the new General Secretary of the SED Central Committee. Krenz had been approached several months earlier about ousting Honecker, but was reluctant to move against a man that he called my foster father and political teacher. He was initially willing to wait until the seriously ill Honecker died, but by October was convinced that the situation was too grave to wait for what he had called a biological solution. In his first address as leader, Krenz promised to blunt some of the harsher edges of Honecker's regime and promised democratic reforms. The speech was identical to the one he had given to a closed group of the SED Central Committee. He even addressed the national audience as Genossen, or comrades, a term reserved for members of the SED. The speech sounded formulaic, and few East Germans believed him. Indeed, almost as soon as he took power, thousands of East Germans took to the streets to demand his resignation. On the 1st of December, the Volkskammer significantly amended the East German constitution to purge it of its communist character. Most notably, Article 1, which declared East Germany to be a socialist state under the leadership of the SED, was deleted. 2 days later, the entire Politburo and Central Committee, including Krenz, resigned, and a working committee took over direction of the party. On the 6th of December 1989, Krenz resigned from his remaining leadership posts. He was succeeded as head of state by LDPD leader Manfred Gerlach in a bid to rehabilitate itself against East Germany's first free election. The successor, organized to the SED, the Party of Democratic Socialism, expelled Krenz and several other former leaders of the communist regime in 1990. In 1997, Krenz was sentenced to 6.5 years imprisonment for Cold War crimes, specifically manslaughter of 4 Germans attempting to escape East Germany over the Berlin Wall. He was also charged with electoral fraud, along with other criminal offenses. He was released from prison in December 2003 after serving nearly 4 years of his sentence and quietly retired with his wife Erika to Dierhen in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. He remained on parole until the end of his sentence in 2006, and as of writing this, on the 31st of July 2025, he is still alive and well. Rezső of Hungary. In the summer of 1988, Secretary General Károly Garros announced that he intended to resign from his position of Prime Minister to concentrate entirely on the party organization. Unlike the previous practice, he nominated 4 candidates, including Nyers, to the position to consult with the county party committees, trade unions, and the Patriotic People's Front. As Grosz was aware of the disastrous economic situation and impending insolvency, Miklos Nemeth, who had established his reputation with his economic expertise, was also included. Finally, the 66-year-old Niers withdrew from candidature in favor of Nemeth, who took the oath of office on the 24th of November, 1988. By this time, Niers had become one of the most prominent members of a faction of radical reformers who wanted to jettison the communist system in favor of a market economy. Other members of this faction included Nemeth, fellow Minister of State Imre Poschke, and Foreign Minister Gyula Horn. On the 26th of June 1989, Niers was elected as president of the MSZMP, chairing a four-member collective presidency that replaced the Politburo. Niers was elected by about 78 to 80% of the 1,256 delegates to the party Congress. In this position, Niers now outranked Grosz, thus effectively making him the leader of Hungary. Other members of the collective presidency included Grosz, Nemeth, and Poschke. By this time, the MSZMP was no longer a Marxist-Leninist party. At its final Congress on 7th of October 1989, the MSZMP voted to disband and refound itself as the Hungarian Socialist Party, with Niers as its first chairman. He was elected to parliament in the 1990 parliamentary election, in which the newly minted socialists were severely defeated, winning only 33 seats. Niers stepped down as chairman shortly afterward. He then died on the 22nd of June 2018. Wojciech Jaruzelski of Poland. According to Jaruzelski, an international crackdown on solidarity through martial law was necessary to avoid a Soviet invasion. In a May 1992 interview with Der Spiegel, Jaruzelski said, "Given the strategic logic of the time, I probably would have acted the same way if I had been a Soviet general. At that time, Soviet political and strategic interests were threatened." Jaruzelski also claimed in 1997 that Washington had given him a green light, stating that he had sent Eugenius Molshik to confer with the Vice President George H.W. Bush, who had agreed with Molshik that martial law was the lesser of two evils. Whether this meeting with the American Vice President actually occurred is disputed. While it is erroneously cited, Harvard historian Mark Kramer has pointed out that no documents support Jaruzelski's claim. Contrary to his public statements after the fact, Jaruzelski was in fact highly insistent on Warsaw Pact military support. Following along back and forth at Warsaw Pact and Politburo meetings, in which even a proposed bluffing statement of support was vetoed by Romania, any notion of a Warsaw Pact intervention was firmly and consequently shut down by Yuri Andropov in a Politburo meeting 3 days before Jaruzelski's proclamation, "We do not intend to introduce troops into Poland. This is the proper position, and we must adhere to it until the end. I don't know how things will turn out in Poland, but even if Poland falls under the control of Solidarity, that's the way it will be." The communists initially intended to give Solidarity a few token cabinet posts for the sake of appearances. However, Lech Walesa persuaded the communist two allied parties, the Union's People's Party and the Alliance of Democrats, to break their alliance with the PZPR, accepting that he would have to appoint a Solidarity member as prime minister. Jaruzelski then asked Walesa to select 3 candidates, one of whom he would ask to form a government. Ultimately, Tadeusz Mazowiecki, who would help organize the roundtable talks, was selected as first non-communist prime minister of an Eastern Bloc country in 4 decades. Jaruzelski resigned as president in 1990 and was succeeded by Walesa, who had won the presidential election on the 9th of December. Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania. Demonstrations in the city of Timișoara were triggered by the government-sponsored attempt to evict László Tőkés, an ethnic Hungarian pastor accused by the government of inciting ethnic hatred. Members of his ethnic Hungarian congregation surrounded his apartment in a show of support. Romanian students spontaneously joined the demonstration, which soon lost nearly all connection to its initial cause and became of a more general anti-government demonstration. Regular military forces, police, and the Securiat fired on demonstrators on the 17th of December 1989, killing and injuring men, women, and children. On the 18th of December 1989, Ceausescu departed for a state visit to Iraq, leaving the duty of crushing the Timișoara revolts to his subordinates and his wife Elena. Upon his return to Romania on the evening of the 20th of December, the situation became even more tense, and he gave a televised speech from the TV studio inside the Central Committee building, in which he spoke about the events at Timișoara in terms of an interference of foreign forces in Romania's internal affairs and an external aggression on Romania's sovereignty. On the next day, the 21st of December, Ceausescu staged a mass meeting in Bucharest. Official media presented it as a spontaneous movement of support for Ceausescu. The mass meeting on the 21st of December, held in what is now Revolution Square, became like many of Ceausescu's speeches over the year. He spoke over the achievements of the Socialist Revolution and Romania's multilaterally developed socialist society. He also blamed the Timișoara riots on fascist agitators who wanted to destroy socialism. However, Ceausescu had misjudged the crowd's mood. Roughly 8 minutes into his speech, several people began jeering and booing, and others began chanting Timișoara. He tried to silence them by raising his right hand and calling for the crowd's attention before order was temporarily restored. Then proceed to announce social benefit reforms that included raising the national minimum wage. Images of Ceausescu's facial expressions as the crowd began to boo and heckle him were among the most widely broadcast of the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. Failing to control the crowd, the Ceausescus took cover inside the building that housed the Central Committee of the Romanian Communist Party. The rest of the day saw an open revolt of Bucharest's population, which had assembled in University Square and confronted the police and army at barricades. The rioters, however, were no match for the military apparatus concentrated in Bucharest, which cleared the streets by midnight and arrested hundreds of people in the process. Ceausescu made a last desperate attempt to address the crowd gathered in front of the Central Committee building, but the people in the square began throwing stones and other projectiles at him, forcing him to take refuge in the building once more. He, Elena, and 4 others managed to get onto the roof and escape by helicopter, only seconds ahead of a group of demonstrators who had followed them there. Ceausescu and his wife Elena fled the capital with 2 other members and flew by a helicopter to Ceausescu's Snagov residence, from which they fled, again, this time to Târgoviște. They abandoned the helicopter near Târgoviște, having been ordered to land by the army, which by that time had restricted flying in Romania's airspace. The Ceausescus were held by the police while the policemen listened to the radio. They were eventually handed over to the army. On Christmas Day, the 25th of December, 1989, the Ceausescus were tried before a court, convened in a small room on orders of the National Salvation Front, Romania's provisional government. They faced charges including illegal gathering of wealth and genocide. Ceausescu repeatedly denied the court's authority to try him and asserted he was still legally the president of Romania. At the end of the trial, the Ceausescus were found guilty and sentenced to death. A soldier standing guard at the proceedings was ordered to take the Ceausescus outside, one by one, and shoot them. But the Ceausescus demanded to die together. The soldiers agreed to this. Before his sentence was carried out, Nicolae Ceausescu sang the Internationale whilst being led towards the wall. The firing squad began shooting as soon as the 2 were in their positions up against the wall. The execution was so swift, the cameraman could only capture the last round of bullets. The Ceausescus were the very last people to be executed before Romania abolished the death penalty on the 7th of January, 1990.